citadel of the hallowed city was made to stray grievously about the coasts of men, the sport of their customs, good or bad, while his heart, through all the seafaring, ached in agony to redeem himself.
The translation of those opening lines of Homer's Odyssey was made at RAF Mountbatten on the edge of Plymouth Sound by a man whose circumstances the words seem perfectly to fit. Thomas Edward Lawrence, alias Ross, alias Shaw, otherwise Lawrence of Arabia. He'd spent 2 decades destroying his own legend and busted himself down from full colonel to common soldier before, at Mountbatten, as an aircraftsman second class, he found a few years of peace.
A man's enlisting is his acknowledgement of defeat by life. Amongst 100 serving men, you will not find one whole or happy. Remember how we, the enlisted men, have all been cowed. Behind us, in our trial of civvy life, is the shadow of failure.
His barracks at Mountbatten and his cottage at Clouds Hill in Dorset were twin sanctuaries for T.E. Lawrence in the 6 years before a fatal motorbike accident in May 1935 brought an enigmatic life to an even more bizarre conclusion. His effigy in St. Martin's Church at Wareham captures the noble contours of the imperial hero, the man whose leadership and inspiration helped the Arabs to drive their Turkish oppressors from the Middle East. But nothing in the marble likeness of the desert warlord betrays the reason why, when the battle was done, he spurned a clutch of honours and the offer of high positions in government and chose instead to bury himself in the ranks. In Uxbridge, John Hume Ross. 4 months later, the press unravelled his secret and he was discharged. Another 8 weeks, and disguised this time as T.E. Shaw, he became a private soldier in the Tank Corps at Bovington in Dorset and plunged into the brutalities of enlisted life.
They have put us into maudlin fear, to moral abasement. I have been before at depots and have seen or overseen the training of men, but this, our treatment, is rank cruelty. While my mouth is yet hot with it, I want to record that some of those who day by day exercise their authority upon us do it in the lust of cruelty. There is a glitter in their faces when we sob for breath.
Initially, he had a very rough time. I mean, 1 or 2 of the people in the hut who made friends with him, in fact, protected him from the rest. In fact, on one occasion, he was, to prove the point that he needed the rest, he needed mind suicide, as he put it. Night after night, he used to have these nightmares where he'd speak out loud and relive all his wartime experiences, some of them quite horrific. And it kept everybody else in the hut awake. And what they did was they got together and gave him an unofficial court-martial. They mocked him. It was most embarrassing for him, and that was the sort of existence he was prepared to put up with in order to nurse his mind back through a 15-year, right up to his death, a 15-year convalescence to normality. And to some extent, he achieved that normality by the time he'd finished life in the ranks.
Lawrence's nightmares were bred from the corruption of his youthful dreams. In a brilliant university career, he favoured the study of crusades and of medieval chivalry. As an archaeologist, he travelled to one of the few remaining corners of the world where the ideals of chivalry might be said to survive, Arabia. When the First World War broke out, Lawrence was drawn deeper and deeper into the Arab revolt against the Turks. His innocent vigour and mental agility made him a natural leader. He unified the fragments of the Arab tribes into an army that swept to liberation. He dreamed of a single Arabic nation, if not free, at least self-governing under benign British protection. Instead, at the war's end, he saw the Allies squabble over the states of the Middle East as if they were a dish of petrochemical plums and divide the choicest fruits among themselves. Lawrence was offered the DSO and the companionship of the Order of the Bath. He rejected both. He accepted a croix de guerre from the French and pinned it to a dog in Oxford as a gesture of contempt. He spurned the chance of cabinet posts and demanded instead the wilderness of the military ranks, warning, as he travelled into obscurity, that the division of Arabia would plant seeds of conflict that would flower and ripen for generations to come.
For once, fortune favoured the bold player, and the Arab epic tossed up its stormy road from birth, through weakness, pain and doubt, to red victory. But after victory came a slow time of disillusion, and then a night in which the fighting men found that all their hopes had failed them. As for myself, the efforts for all these years to live in the dress of Arabs and to imitate their mental foundation quitted me of my English self and let me look at the West with new eyes. At the same time, I could not sincerely take on the Arab skin. Sometimes these selves would converse in the void, and then madness was very near.
But there was a kind of schizophrenia lurking in Lawrence's heritage before ever his passions were scissored between England and Arabia. His father was Thomas Chapman, an Anglo-Irish landowner who raised a family of daughters in County Meath before falling in love with their governess. At as many different addresses, the exiled gentleman and the governess brought 5 sons into the world, wrestling along the way with the problem of how to describe themselves. The future Lawrence of Arabia was the second son. Throughout his life, he agonized in case his illegitimacy should be discovered. After his descent into the ranks, having abandoned the names of Lawrence and Ross, living uneasily as Shaw, he would urge his friends to call him simply Thomas Edward, the only names he could safely claim for his own. Public officials, from the Prime Minister downwards, schemed to protect Lawrence in his quest for the anonymity of the ranks. It was indeed a curious private soldier who was allowed to rent a cottage at Clouds Hill, a little over a mile from his barrack block at Bovington.
On the pediment here behind me, on Lawrence's cottage, are inscribed the words "U Frontis," and these come from a Greek myth, and roughly translated they mean, I don't care, it doesn't matter, I couldn't give a damn. And that was really basically summed up Lawrence's whole attitude to his cottage here. When he first came here, he rented it from a relation. It was in a state of dilapidation. It was his child, his joy, the only place he's ever considered his own home, the only place that ever was a home for him, which he could really call his. One can imagine him sitting here late at night on his own, stoking the fire, playing his favorite music, Beethoven, Mozart, Bach. The loneliness always returns.
Lawrence rented Clouds Hill in 1923 and bought the cottage in 1925. There he finished The 7 Pillars of Wisdom, his epic on the Arabian Revolt, and began The Mint, a scarifying account of barrack life. He entertained his near neighbours, Thomas and Florence Hardy, as well as E.M. Forster and George Bernard Shaw. But the publicity surrounding the 7 Pillars shattered his domestic harmony in Dorset, and after a brief spell as an aircraftsman in Cranwell, he secured a posting to India. Even there, he was denied the obscurity he sought. Rumours erupted that he'd been sent to foment a revolt in Afghanistan. Why, the newspapers asked, was Colonel Lawrence masquerading as aircraftsman Shaw if he wasn't engaged in some secret mission? The reluctant celebrity was brought back to England and ordered to RAF Mountbatten. At the new RAF station on Plymouth's foreshore, he discovered security and friendship. He was adopted by the commanding officer, Sidney Smith, and his family. Instead of the crudity and harshness he'd experienced at Bovington, he found comradeship at Mountbatten with fellow servicemen. Archie Cheeseman was one of them.
I tweaked something there, and then, of course, as soon as I was told, I knew all about him. How he was caught up in sort of blame for some trouble in India, was posted home, and where others, like myself, a posting, you'd go to Southampton and carry on from there, not him. He was brought into the Sound, and the motorboat went out to meet him and brought him to Catwater. He was such great friends with the CO of the station, and his wife and daughter, that he'd be invited out to the supper. And quite a common saying in the camp, get the silver out tonight. Mr. Shaw is coming himself.
Undoubtedly, his period, his 12 years overall, with the 2 years in the tank corps, which was a kind of hiccup in the middle, were the happiest years of his life, personally. And the fascinating thing is that most people who know something or a little bit about Lawrence tend to think of the success and the fame and the glory as being Lawrence of Arabia in the desert with the Arabs. But in fact, the reverse is true. He considered that himself a complete failure, and for the rest of his life, he was trying to forget it and Lawrence of Arabia. He considered the success to be both his mechanical work, which he loved, and his relationships with people. Basically, the last 15 years of his life was a saga of kindness to other people, little kindnesses, which he never drew attention to outside. Aircraftmen in Mountbatten, for example, might be, as young men are, short of money on a Saturday night. He would walk into a hut and plonk down some money on the table and say, "Share it amongst you," and then walk quietly out. His life was littered with little kindnesses like that, which are unchronicled and unknown.
At Mountbatten, Lawrence immersed himself in the practicalities of RAF life. Using guile and influence, the humble aircraftsman achieved a range of reforms, from the abolition of capital punishment for cowardice to the simple task, hardly glamorous perhaps, but profound in its effect on morale, of making the uniform more comfortable and more handsome. He helped to pioneer the development of marine craft and seaplanes, and after a catastrophic crash in Plymouth Sound in 1931, caused partly by a confusion of command, he led the rescue efforts. And when they failed, he worked on the design of faster rescue craft that could achieve speeds of up to 23 knots. At the same time, he lobbied connections in Whitehall and Westminster to ensure that in future, a pilot would outrank every other officer while the plane was in the air. In the days when the infant Air Force was struggling to find a role and an identity, Lawrence had a visionary awareness of its potential.
Right from the moment that Lawrence came out of the Middle East, he was on fire with the thought of the air because of the part that the Air Force, or that the Flying Corps played in the Middle East. And during the late 20s and early 30s, when he contacted one of his old friends from the Middle East time, he was absolutely fuming at the way that the government seemed totally blind to what might happen, and surely enough did happen in the Second World War when Britain was totally unprepared aerially. He fumed away, so the government, the politicians had their head in the sand, nobody was doing anything. In fact, in that sense, he had much in common with Churchill, who was in the wilderness at the time, and no one would listen to him about the fact that we needed our air defences to be on the alert and to be improved. He very much had a vision of the air much before its time.
By our handling of this, the one big new thing, will our time be judged. Upon the start we give our successors in the arts of the air will depend the redressing of our 18th century army and silly ships. We face something whose scale towers out of our imagination.
As an aircraftsman, Lawrence could never aspire to be a pilot, yet he all but flew at weekends as he raced between Mountbatten and Clouds Hill on his ferocious Brough Superior motorbike.
The burble of my exhaust unwound like a long cord behind me. Soon my speed snapped it, and I heard only the cry of the wind, which my battering head split and fended aside. The cry rose with my speed to a shriek, while the air's coldness streamed like 2 jets of iced water into my dissolving eyes. A glance at the speedometer, 78. I pull the throttle right open on top of the slope, and we swoop, flying across the dip, the machine launching itself like a projectile with a whir of wheels into the air at the takeoff of each rise.
May the 13th, 1935. Lawrence is returning to Clouds Hill from Bovington. Just 10 weeks before, he'd left the RAF. It's late morning, the weather is good. Ahead of him are 2 pedal cyclists, Bertie Hargreaves, a butcher's boy, and his pal, Frank Fletcher.
Well, I can remember that Bertie Hargreaves myself coming up this road here, but just down above there's a big dip. And when he gets up the big dip, the road levels up a bit more along there, then there's another dip. Well, Bertie and I was more like up here when he said to me, "There's a motorbike coming, you know." So I said to him, well, the best thing for us to do is to get into the side, which we did do. Well, we got up far as here, and all of a sudden, he smacked it at the back. His butcher's bike wheel was busted,